So far, we've been considering whether or not morality is objective. What reasons would we be able to give in support of the claim that morality applies to everyone, everywhere, universally? Now, what I want to do is consider what reasons or what arguments somebody might offer for the claim that morality is actually subjective, that it's relative to one's culture or one's society. So the first thing that I want to mention is I want to bring your attention to that quote we saw previously that Aristotle offers regarding the nature of ethics. Remember that Aristotle says, ethics is an inexact science. Ethics is a science of the circumstances of life. And of course, morality is messy because life is messy. The circumstances of life are changing and shifting, and not everything is going to be the same for everyone. Different cultures experience their world in different ways. Societies handle different issues in a lot of different ways, depending upon what the details of the circumstances happen to be. So, in that way, Aristotle thinks that it's an inexact science, it's not precise. But we might wonder whether or not that automatically means that it's subjective. Does this mean that morality is just relative to whatever your experience happens to be? What's morally correct for you might be not correct for someone else. What's morally true for me might be false for you. Is that the kind of view that we need to endorse? And if so, does that mean that we can't have moral knowledge? That moral knowledge is impossible? These are questions that we need to consider. We often think that, for instance, science or scientific knowledge is a descriptive inquiry. We are describing the way the world is. And since morality is prescriptive or normative, we're not describing something that's universally true for everyone, that applies everywhere for everyone. Since morality it prescribes the way the world ought to be or the way this world should be, you might think that that depends upon what you think about the world. Maybe you think the world should have less poverty. Maybe other people don't really care about poverty. So these are the sorts of reasons that sometimes people offer for why morality seems subjective or relative to one's culture or to one's society. Now, what I want to do is consider some specific arguments for this claim because we want to consider whether these arguments are defensible or whether they should be rejected. So, the first argument that I have in mind is one of the most famous arguments. Maybe it's the sort of thing that you've already been familiarized with. It's based upon the notion of cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is actually a scientific thesis. It's a descriptive claim in scientific fields like anthropology. What it says is that cultures are different in a lot of different ways. Right? Different cultures have different customs, different practices, different moralities. And so this thesis has a descriptive claim about the way the world is, you might think is true, or at least plausible. Cultural relativism as an argument, though, is somewhat different. It begins with the cultural relativism thesis. It says different cultures have different moralities and different customs and so forth. That's the first premise in the argument. But then it moves from that premise, which looks true, or at least plausible, and it tries to infer other claims about the nature of morality, whether it's objective or subjective. So the second premise then says, if different cultures have different moralities, then there is no objective morality. Therefore, there is no objective morality. So then the fourth premise says, well, if there is no objective morality, then morality is at best subjective or in some sense relative to one's culture or whatever one's society happens to say. And if that's the case, then we can conclude that at best, morality is subjective or relative in this sort of way. Now, this is the cultural relativism argument based upon the cultural relativism thesis that we find in anthropology. And I think this is the sort of argument that is oftentimes endorsed in support of the claim that morality is subjective or in some sense relative. But what I want to do now is consider what sort of objections one might offer to this argument. Is it a good argument? Should we endorse it? First objection says, well, this argument involves a non sequitur. And what we mean by the non sequitur fallacy is that the conclusion does not follow from the premises. So the mere fact that different cultures or different societies might happen to disagree about what morality says, they might disagree about lots of different things in this regard. It does not automatically mean that morality is subjective or that there's no answer to our question of whether or not there's a foundation for morality, right? So consider the following kind of argument, which is clearly invalid, and I think shows nicely why this is a non sequitur. So the argument that I want you to think about is the following. Different people disagree about the shape of the earth. Therefore, there is no shape to the earth. The shape of the earth is just subjective. If you happen to think it's flat, that's true for you, but other people might think that it's spherical. Clearly, this argument is invalid. We should reject it. But this argument has the same structure as the cultural relativism argument. So if you think there's something problematic with this argument, namely that the conclusion does not follow from the premises, well, then you should say the same thing about the previous argument, because the only real difference here is we're talking about the shape of the earth rather than whether morality is objective. So that's one problem. That's the first objection to this argument. So just to summarize briefly what this objection says, if we do not accept this argument, then we should not accept the cultural relativism argument either. Now let's move on to the second objection. This objection says that the argument is unsound, which means that at least one of the premises are false. We need to think about which premise in this case would be false. But if the argument is unsound, then that's a reason to reject the argument. So which of the premises in this argument might be false? Well, notice that the second premise says, if different cultures have different moralities, then there is no objective morality. Well, it turns out that that premise is false. It could be the case that different cultures have different moralities. Nonetheless, there is some single objective morality. Maybe one of those cultures are right. So if we accept this first objection, the one that says that it's a non sequitur, that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise, well, then we should also reject the second premise, right? Because it's telling us that if the cultural relativism thesis is true, then there's no objective morality. And it looks like that premise is false. So we should reject this premise too. The truth of cultural relativism does not entail the truth of moral relativism or the claim that morality is subjective. So at this point, it looks like we have at least two reasons, two objections for why we should reject the argument. Now let's consider a third objection. This objection says that intuitively, there's a number of absurdities that follow from accepting the truth of moral subjectivism or moral relativism. If morality is dependent upon whatever our culture says, right, if it differs from one culture to another, then we would have no way to criticize or judge other practices, other cultures, right? So for instance, you might think that we should be able to judge what's happening in Ukraine, right? The Russian invasion of Ukraine, you might think is morally problematic in a lot of different ways. But if relativism is true, then that's just what's happening in their culture and their society. And it's not in our culture, not in our society. So we have no way to judge it as being morally problematic. We have no way to criticize practices that are happening on the other side of the world in this sense. You might even think that the war crimes like bombing a hospital full of children or a school full of children, these are war crimes that are taking place in Ukraine that are perpetrated by the Russian army. So you might think we should be able to criticize these practices. But again, how can we if cultural relativism is true? That's not happening in our culture, so we can't really say anything about it. We have no basis to criticize what's happening there. Or take, for example, compulsory hijab laws in Iran or in Afghanistan, for instance. These are laws in those societies that claim, based upon religious beliefs, that it's morally wrong to show, for instance, your hair in public if you're a woman or a small girl. You might think, well, that is morally wrong. That's morally problematic. But you cannot criticize them if you're not a part of that culture. But notice that this seems very absurd. Take, for instance, on September 13th in 2022, where a woman named Mahash Amani was put to death by the Irani government for showing her hair. Right, she violated these compulsory hijab laws. You might think that is morally absurd. They should not be killed simply for showing their hair. We have no ability, no justification for criticizing this practice, this moral constraint on what people are allowed to do in that society. If it turns out that morality is entirely subjective and dependent upon whatever a person's culture says. Or consider another kind of moral atrocity that occurs in the world. Female genital mutilation happens in different places in the world where women are circumcised at a very young age. You might think that this is morally wrong. This is just morally absurd. People should not be doing this. But that's only because we don't do it in our society. This isn't something that we practice. But if you live in a different society and morality is relative to whatever your society says, then here in the United States, we have no way to criticize those other societies, right? Presumably, most of us are going to agree that female genital mutilation or killing someone for showing their hair or bombing a hospital or a school full of children, these sort of things are moral atrocities and they should be criticized, right? So this is supposed to be a counterexample to the claim that morality is relative to whatever your society says. But things get even worse. This objection actually stands beyond just our ability to criticize other societies for what they happen to do. It turns out that if morality is dependent upon what one's culture says, then we would not have a way to criticize or judge the practices in one's own culture. And it looks like there's lots of ways in which we do criticize our own culture. I, for one, criticize our government for all sorts of different things. I think that there's things that occur in our society that are morally problematic. In fact, you might think that this is one of the great things about living in a society like the United States. We have the ability to criticize our own society when we find that we are engaging in practices that are morally problematic. So take, for instance, the civil rights movement in the 1960s. This is an excellent example of how we can criticize our own society, our own culture, our own government for the sorts of things that were taking place at that time. Or currently, the Black Lives Matters movement, I think, is another great example. It's sort of like the civil rights movement, but in contemporary society, where we criticize what's happening with regard to police practices and the treatment of Black and Brown people, or women's rights movements throughout the 20th century and even today. Right? This is another example where we intuitively think that it's not only morally permissible, maybe it's even morally obligatory of us to criticize the misogynistic practices of our society, or LGBTQ rights, right? These examples are counterexamples to the claim that moral relativism is true. Because if moral relativism is true and morality is just subjective to whatever our society says, we would have no way to criticize the claim held by some people in this culture that being gay is morally wrong, or the transphobia that exists in this society. So just to summarize this point and to kind of drive it home, if subjectivism is true, right? If morality is subjective and relative to whatever our culture says, then we would have no way to justify these movements. In fact, it looks like moral progress itself would be impossible. But if you're like me and you think that moral progress is possible, I think there are clear examples where our society has gotten better. Well, then that would be a counterexample to the cultural relativism argument or the claim that morality is relative or subjective. But maybe there's a different argument that we consider. Maybe this argument from cultural relativism could be rejected. Still, there may be a different sort of argument that would show why we would want to accept the kind of relativism or subjectivism that we're considering. And this is because it might be the case that proponents of subjectivism or relativism are saying something different. Maybe what they're really trying to say is that there's no cultural neutral standard by which we can use to determine whether some moral claim is true or false. And if it turns out that that's true, if there is no culturally neutral standard that we can use, then we would not be able to criticize other cultures after all. So this is what I'm going to call the cultural neutral standard argument for moral relativism or moral subjectivism. And essentially it begins with the notion that our moral standards are in some sense theory laden. And what it means to say that they're theory laden is simply that our moral judgments are based upon certain standards. And so far as they are highly influenced by all sorts of different background perspectives or background assumptions that an individual already is bringing to the table when they're making that judgment. Indeed, you might also think that these sort of background assumptions only exist within some particular culture or some context or some society, right? The assumptions are kind of a product of one's culture. The background perspectives that we bring to the table are the product of the society that we happen to live in. So, if we're willing to make this kind of assumption regarding our moral judgments and the standards we use to make such judgments, and I think there's some reason to think that this sort of view is plausible, then it looks like these standards are theory laden in this kind of way. Well, all of that would indicate that there is no way to escape the fact that we have no culturally neutral standard which we can use to correctly judge one's culture or others' cultures. Okay, now that I've kind of set the stage, let's consider what this argument actually says. Let's put all of this information into the form of an argument. And again, just to label this argument so that we can keep it distinguished from the previous argument, I'm calling it the no cultural neutral standard argument. The first premise of this argument says that the ability to make an unbiased and objective moral judgment requires that we use unbiased and objective standards. Well, the second premise then says an unbiased and objective standard must be a standard that is culturally neutral. Well, you might have guessed then the third premise says we don't have that sort of standard. We don't have a culturally neutral way to go about or a culturally neutral method of going about judging other cultures. So if you accept these three premises, then it follows that we don't have an unbiased and objective standard. And since we don't have that kind of a standard, then we can't make an unbiased and objective moral judgment. So that's what this argument says. I think that it's a really interesting argument, and it certainly is an improvement over the one that we considered previously. Nonetheless, you might think there's still some problems with the argument that we should consider. So let's look at some reasons why we might be skeptical of this argument. Here's one objection. We might think that the same sort of worries that applied to the previous argument will also apply to this argument. So we would not be able to judge other cultures. So for instance, when we consider the case of female genital mutilation, since we don't have a culturally neutral standard to criticize other cultures that engage in this practice, we simply wouldn't be justified in criticizing them or saying about female genital mutilation that it's morally wrong. And you might think that's absurd. Ditto for the case of the Russian invasion in Ukraine and for war crimes, bombing a school full of children and so forth. Intuitively, if you're like me, you might want to say, yes, bombing a school full of children is morally wrong, and we can criticize a culture that engages in that practice. But if we have no culturally neutral standard, then we have no way to, or no justification for making such a judgment. Now, with regard to the question of whether we can judge our own culture, this may not be as clear because you might be able to say, well, look, since we're using a standard that's within our own culture, then we can apply that standard to our culture. But I think that that's not going to work because remember that relativism says that whatever your culture says is correct, right? If your culture happens to say that female genital mutilation is morally permissible, then that's true. It's true because it's subjective or relative to whatever your culture says. It's dependent upon what your culture says. And so what your culture says can't be wrong. Therefore, we can't even judge or criticize our own culture, as in the case of police brutality against Black and Brown individuals. We can't say that's morally wrong because it's just a part of our culture, and we can't criticize our culture insofar as our culture can't be wrong. I think most people, at least if you're like me, would agree that that must be false. That must be incorrect. Surely we should be able to criticize our own culture, as in a case where women are not treated equally as men, or as in the case where police are killing Black men simply because they're Black. Those sort of cases, I think intuitively most people will accept are morally wrong. Of course, the same point can be raised with regard to moral progress, right? So if moral relativism is true, then we can't make any kind of moral progress for the same sorts of reasons that we've seen previously. But that seems wrong. That seems absurd. When we consider a city, for instance, that puts into practices or different rules and regulations in order to try to minimize or eliminate the kinds of police brutality against Black and Brown people, that seems to be a form of moral progress. May not be perfect. There may be a lot more that we can still do, but nonetheless, we should recognize progress when it occurs. But if moral relativism is true, if morality is subjective to whatever the society says, then that kind of progress would be impossible. Now, another sort of objection is just simply it's not clear why one could not have an objective standard that is theory laden. This sort of thing happens all the time within the sciences. All of the sciences and scientific inquiry in general is theory laden for the same sorts of reasons that we've already been considering with regard to our ability to judge other cultures. But we don't think that this necessarily means that science is not objective. In fact, we think that science is objective even though it's theory laden. And if that's true of the sciences, why can't it be true of morality as well? Indeed, you might think that all we really need is some sort of standard that applies in all or at least most cultures. And maybe we can find a standard, even though it might be theory laden, nonetheless, it might be a standard that can be applied. So, for instance, consider the claim that harming people causes suffering and that suffering is a bad thing. Right? That seems to be a standard that's going to apply to every single human being, no matter what society you happen to live in. Or what about the claim that there's never been a society where the murder rate is higher than the birth rate, right? Societies have to have a birth rate that's higher than the murder rate. Otherwise, the society itself will go out of existence. And it seems, intuitively speaking at least, a standard that we can use that's going to apply to every society and that can be used to criticize other cultures, other societies. Now, what I want to do is move on to a different sort of argument. This is an argument that was offered by Hume, and sometimes it's been labeled the is-ought problem. David Hume was an Enlightenment thinker, lived from 1711 to 1776, and he was a very skeptical philosopher, posed all sorts of skeptical problems, and obviously the skeptical issue that we're considering now has to do with whether or not morality is objective. Now, recall that science is descriptive. It says what is the case. It describes the way the world is, hence the is and the is ought problem. And remember that morality is prescriptive or normative. It tells us how the world ought to be. It tells us what should be the case. It prescribes the way we ought to live or what obligations we have, hence the ought and the is ought problem. So here's what Hume did. Hume used this distinction between an is of science and an ought of morality, and then argued that you cannot derive an ought of morality from an is of science, right? We can't simply state the way the world is and then infer some way the world ought to be or what moral obligations we happen to have. The basic idea behind this argument is no matter how much information you plug into the argument, no matter how much descriptive scientific data we have, you're never going to be able to justify a normative conclusion that tells us what we ought to do. That is, unless we have a value claim, we need to introduce some value statement, something that we care about, it's only then that we're going to be in position to say what we ought to do, right? So we need a value claim to be introduced into the argument as a premise. That's what we need in order to justify deriving an ought from an is. That might still seem a little bit complicated and convoluted. So I want to try to explain all this by using an example, using an argument that is clearly bad. Consider the following. The first premise says smoking is bad for your health. It causes cancer and death. That would be the is of science. The second premise, the conclusion, says you should not smoke. Right? So the basic idea here is science has shown that smoking is bad for your health. It causes cancer and it causes death. Therefore, you should not smoke. This is a bad argument for the sorts of reasons that we were just talking about. What we need is to introduce a value claim, something about not wanting to die from cancer. So we can do that, and then it will become a good argument. Consider this argument. The first premise says smoking is bad for your health. It causes cancer and death and so forth. So that much stays the same. Now, the second premise says Christopher values having good health. Christopher values not getting cancer. Christopher doesn't want to die, and so on and so forth. All right, so once we've plugged into the argument Christopher's values here, well, then we can infer the conclusion that says Christopher should not smoke. But what if you don't care about good health? What if you don't care about not dying? Well, then you would not be able to derive that particular conclusion about you because you lack particular value. And so this is what we mean then when we say that it's only by adding this value claim regarding some individual, it's only then that the argument works. Now the problem becomes that it's not clear what we mean by values. Are values objective in some sense? Clearly, values aren't like tables and chairs. They're not physical objects in the world. But does that mean that science can't investigate or study them? Are values even real entities at all? Maybe they're abstract objects like numbers or sets. Moreover, lots of people have different values. I might value not smoking, somebody else might not care. I might value having good health, but maybe somebody else doesn't. I might value my daughter's well-being, but maybe somebody else doesn't really care. I might value all sorts of different things that other people don't. And so people clearly have different values. And if that's right, then you might think that values are subjective, right? They're psychological things about us, and that's it. They are not the sort of thing that we can scientifically investigate. They're not objective in that sense. So, once again, it looks like we're stuck in a situation where moral reasoning turns out to be subjective rather than objective. And that's because it's not at all clear in what way we could say that moral values are objective.